Cedar Ridge County Shelter was a place of sterile walls, echoing silence, and an underlying heaviness that seemed to suffocate the souls that found themselves there. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find hope, but it was where some of the most fragile, broken spirits resided. The shelter's main task was to shelter, but some animals stayed for so long that the shelter itself started to shape them, mold them, into something different from what they once were. Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd, had spent nearly 4 years in this quiet, suffocating place. At one point, he had been full of life, a dog with a hopeful heart, ready to run through open fields and find a new family. But now, he was a shadow of his former self, tucked away in the corner of his kennel where light barely touched his fur. His once proud posture had shrunk into something more cautious, wary, almost defeated. His eyes, which once gleamed with excitement, were now dull and tired. He no longer sought the gaze of visitors or shelter staff. Instead, he lay there quietly, withdrawn from the world around him. The staff had long since given up on him. They called him withdrawn, a polite way of saying he had given up, as had they. They referred to him as a long shot for adoption, a term that, in their eyes, meant he was not likely to ever leave. There was no anger or sadness in their words, just a resigned acceptance of Ranger's fate. He had become just another fixture in the shelter, part of the landscape, unnoticed, unimportant, like the dull hum of the fluorescent lights above. Each day bled into the next, a silent procession of monotony. The only visitors were those who came to check on the animals, the ones who could not bear to stay, because they had nothing to give to the broken hearts behind the bars. Ranger's presence was merely a shadow in the corner of the shelter, a shadow no one paid attention to, a dog no one thought twice about. But that would change. It started with a casual visit. Lena Ortiz had no intention of adopting a dog when she walked into the shelter with her son, Kai. She wasn't looking for a dog, and certainly not one as broken as Ranger, but there was something in her that needed to be there, something that had drawn her to the shelter that afternoon. Perhaps it was the gentle tug in her heart or the subtle call of empathy for the animals who sat waiting for a second chance. Whatever it was, she had brought her son, Kai, along. A quiet, introverted 16-year-old who barely spoke, but who also felt something that pulled him along with her. Lena wasn't the type to make decisions on impulse. She took her time with everything, and that included deciding whether or not she was ready to bring a dog into their home. A dog would change things. It would change everything. But she felt this quiet need, this unspoken desire to connect, to offer something to one of these animals who had been abandoned, overlooked, and left behind. The moment they entered the visitation area, Lena felt her eyes scan over the rows of kennels. The usual suspects were there, excitable puppies, eager to please, jumping at the bars in search of attention. There were older dogs, too, some barking, some wagging their tails, trying to make themselves seen. But then, something caught her eye. Ranger. He was still. Too still. At first, it wasn't his sad eyes or his despondent expression that made her look. It was the sheer lack of movement. All the other dogs were reacting to the visitors, showing themselves off, begging for attention. But not Ranger. He lay in his kennel, unmoving, a faint shadow against the cold concrete floor. His coat was thick but matted, and his eyes stared out from beneath a furrowed brow, not with the eager gaze of a dog hoping for love, but with something more distant, more resigned. Lena approached the kennel, her footsteps muffled by the dull hum of the shelter. She didn't speak at first. She simply watched him. There was something about him, something that pulled at her heart. The other dogs barked, yapped, jumped. But not Ranger. He simply watched her, his gaze calm but distant, like a creature who had seen too much and expected nothing from anyone. Kai, standing beside his mother, was lost in his own thoughts, barely noticing the other dogs around him. He had always been more of an observer, quiet and withdrawn like Ranger. When Lena glanced at him, she saw that his eyes were on the dog too, It was as if they shared the same silence, the same stillness. She stepped closer, and Kai followed, his eyes never leaving the dog. For a moment there was no noise, no chatter of the shelter staff, no barking dogs, just silence. And then, unexpectedly, Ranger moved. It wasn't much, just a subtle shift in his posture, but it was enough. Slowly, as if testing the waters, Ranger rose to his feet. He took a few steps, hesitant, unsure, as if he had forgotten how to trust. Lena crouched down, her eyes softening as she gazed at him. She wasn't sure what had driven her to take the next step, but before she knew it, her hand was reaching through the bars of the kennel. Ranger paused. For a long moment he didn't move. His eyes flickered from her hand to her face and back again. And then, just as slowly, he took a step forward. It was a small thing, a tiny motion, but it was enough. Enough for Lena to understand that this was no ordinary moment. This was a moment where something was about to change. And that was when she realized that this dog, the one who had been labeled withdrawn by everyone around him, had just reached out to her. It was his quiet way of asking for something he didn't know how to express. A chance. The Cedar Ridge County Shelter had seen its share of visitors over the years. Some came with excitement, some with apprehension, and others simply to kill time. But Lena and Kai weren't like the typical visitors. They came with no clear intention, no set plan. Lena was still uncertain about the idea of adopting a dog, especially one like Ranger, who had been at the shelter for so long, but something in her felt that a visit would give her some clarity, some sense of whether they were truly ready to bring an animal into their home. Kai, on the other hand, was as quiet and withdrawn as ever. He didn't speak much, rarely showing interest in the world around him, but today was different. His eyes lingered on Ranger, more than on any other dog in the shelter. He was used to feeling like an outsider, the kind of person who never quite fit in, who preferred the company of books and quiet corners over the noise of social interactions. The idea of having a dog, of caring for another living being, was foreign to him, but something about Ranger's stillness spoke to him. Lena had been trying to engage Kai more lately, trying to break through the shell of his introversion. He had always been this way, withdrawn, shy, often overwhelmed by the world around him. She hoped that maybe a dog could help him open up, help him find a connection that was harder for him to forge with people. She also saw how deeply Kai felt about animals, how he could sit for hours, watching birds in the backyard or caring for the stray cats that wandered into their neighborhood. He had a tenderness in him, one that only a few people ever saw. As they walked through the shelter, Lena couldn't help but feel a sense of heaviness in the air. It was strange to think that all these dogs had once been someone's companion, their friend. Yet here they were, waiting, hoping, needing a second chance. There were several young dogs, full of energy and enthusiasm, bouncing around in their cages. They seemed like the obvious choice for any potential adopter, and yet none of them caught Lena's attention as much as Ranger did. They passed by a few other kennels before stopping in front of Ranger's. This time, she didn't wait for him to move first. Instead, she crouched down immediately and extended her hand through the bars. Ranger stood still, his eyes watching her with cautious curiosity. There was something about the way he looked at her that felt almost pleading, like he was silently asking, "Will you see me?" Kai stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, looking down at the dog. He hadn't said a word since they entered the shelter, but there was a shift in the air. He was paying her attention to Ranger, and that was enough. Lena glanced at him, trying to gauge what he was thinking, but Kai didn't look up. He was staring at the dog, and his face was unreadable, as always. The shelter attendant, a young woman named Sarah, came over to them. She had been following their interaction quietly, watching Lena's gentle approach to Ranger. She cleared her throat, then spoke softly, as though not wanting to disturb the moment. Ranger's a special case, she said. He's been here for almost 4 years. He's not like the other dogs. He's been through a lot, and we think that's why he's so withdrawn. Lena nodded, her heart aching at the thought. What do you mean by withdrawn? Sarah paused, her eyes flicking to Ranger. He doesn't really interact with anyone. He doesn't respond to calls, doesn't get excited when visitors come by. It's like he's given up, just waiting. Lena's heart clenched. She didn't know why, but the idea of a Ranger waiting for someone, anyone, to see him, to give him a chance, made her want to reach out even more. It was as though he had been abandoned not just by his previous owners, but by everyone who had walked by him in the shelter. She looked back at Ranger, who had not moved from his spot, though his gaze had softened. His eyes still held the same sadness, the same longing, but there was something else now, too. Something tentative, something that felt like hope. Lena sat down on the floor in front of his kennel, her back against the wall. She waited, and for the first time, Ranger took a small step toward her. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, and his eyes seemed to search hers for a moment before he took another tentative step closer. Kai shifted slightly, his hands still stuffed in his pockets. But this time, he didn't look away. He watched silently as the dog moved. It was subtle, but there was a connection forming, one that no one had expected. And Lena, sensing that the moment was fragile, spoke softly. I don't know what happened to you, Ranger, but if you let me, I want to take you home. I want to show you what it's like to feel safe again. The words hung in the air for a moment, and then, almost as if on cue, Ranger stepped closer and laid his head against the bars of the kennel just inches away from Lena's hand. She didn't hesitate. She reached through the bars and stroked his fur gently, the soft, matted coat under her fingers. Ranger let out a quiet sigh, and for a moment it felt as though the weight of all those years in the shelter, the loneliness, the quiet resignation, was being released in that one small gesture. Kai stepped forward, still quiet, still reserved, but his eyes met Lena's for the first time since the night they entered the shelter. He didn't speak, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, something that suggested he understood. This wasn't just about adopting a dog. This was about a connection, about something much deeper than just giving Ranger a home. It was about giving both of them the chance to harm. Lena turned to Sarah, who had been watching the entire interaction, and asked, "What do we need to do to adopt him?" The decision to adopt Ranger felt surreal to Lena. It had happened so quickly, almost as if she had been swept along by a force greater than herself. One moment, she'd been a visitor in a shelter, uncertain about whether she was ready to bring a dog into her life. And the next, she was walking away with a 5-year-old German Shepherd who had spent nearly 4 years in a cage. The weight of the responsibility didn't fully hit her until they were driving home, with Ranger lying silently in the back seat, his body stiff with unfamiliarity. Kai sat beside her in the front seat, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He had not spoken much since they left the shelter, and Lena knew he was processing everything in his quiet, introspective way. He hadn't been as immediately attached to the idea of adopting a dog as she had, but he had never resisted either. His silence spoke volumes. He was watching, waiting, unsure of what this change would bring, just like Ranger. The drive home was filled with a quiet tension. Ranger sat still in the back of the car, his gaze fixed on the window, his nose twitching as the world rushed by. It was clear he wasn't used to the movement, the sounds, or the smells of the outside world. His body was tense, every muscle taut with the need to stay alert, to stay safe. But for the first time in years, he was outside of the shelter, and for better or worse, the world was no longer confined to 4 walls. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest home, Lena felt her stomach flutter with nerves. She had promised herself that she would give Ranger the space he needed, that she wouldn't rush him into anything. But now, standing at the edge of her home, she realized that she had no idea how to navigate the vast unknown territory they were about to explore together. And Kai opened the door and got out first, lingering by the front steps as Lena turned off the engine. She glanced into the rearview mirror, meeting Ranger's eyes for a brief moment. His gaze was intense, full of uncertainty, but there was also something else. A spark. It was as though he was considering, questioning, whether this could be the beginning of something new. "Let's go, buddy," Lena said softly, her voice gentle and encouraging, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was reassuring, Ranger or herself. Ranger didn't move at first, his body frozen in place. It was as though the idea of stepping out into this new world, one without the shelter walls, was too overwhelming. The air smelled different here. The ground felt different. The house was full of strange noises, and there were no bars or walls to provide the comfort of confinement. It was a wide, open space that seemed far too big for a dog like him. A dog who had learned to shrink into the corners, to make himself as invisible as possible. Lena stepped out of the car, closing the door behind her, and slowly approached Ranger. She crouched down again, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle him. "It's okay," she whispered, holding out her hand once more. "You're safe now." Kai stood nearby, watching intently, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He had always been quiet, but today, there was something different in his stillness. It was as if he was holding his breath, waiting for Ranger to decide what he would do next. The bond between the two of them was still tentative, like a thread that hadn't quite woven itself together yet, but it was already forming, quietly, subtly. Ranger's eyes flickered between Lena and the wide expanse of the front yard. He took a small step forward, his paws hesitant on the unfamiliar gravel driveway. His body trembled slightly, and his tail remained tucked between his legs. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn and retreat back into the car, but then something shifted. His gaze softened, and he took another step, this time with more purpose. Lena felt a sense of triumph, but she didn't allow herself to get too excited. This wasn't about pushing Ranger to do something he wasn't ready for. This was about creating a space where he could feel safe enough to take that step on his own whenever he was ready. Kai, who had been quiet throughout the process, suddenly crouched down in front of Ranger, his posture mirroring Lena's. The boy's voice was soft, almost inaudible, as he spoke to the dog. It's okay. We're not going to hurt you." Ranger hesitated for a moment, his eyes meeting Kai's. The silence between them stretched on, longer than either of them expected. It was a strange kind of silence, one that wasn't awkward, but full of understanding. It was as if both of them had learned to exist in quiet spaces, finding comfort in stillness rather than noise. And then, with a final, trembling breath, Ranger took another step forward. His body language was still unsure, but it was a step in the right direction. He walked slowly, cautiously, toward the open door of the house, as if testing the boundaries of this new world. Lena opened the door wide, inviting him in. "Welcome home, Ranger," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ranger walked through the threshold of the house, his tail still low, but his body less rigid. He moved past Lena and Kai, his eyes scanning the new environment, every sound and smell foreign and unfamiliar. He was still tentative, still unsure, but there was something undeniably different in his movements, a slight lessening of the tension that had held him captive for so long. Kai followed behind, his eyes never leaving the dog. His quiet presence seemed to offer some sense of reassurance to Ranger, as though he too was learning to trust this new space, this new life. Lena watched them both, Ranger, still uncertain but moving forward, and Kai, stepping carefully into his own role as a companion, a protector. She felt a small warmth bloom in her chest. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was theirs. It was a beginning of something that felt fragile and uncertain, but also full of hope. And in that quiet, gentle moment, Lena realized that she hadn't just adopted a dog. They had both adopted each other. The first few days after bringing Ranger home felt like a careful dance, one of patience, observation, and gradual trust building. Lena had done her research, read every article she could find about dogs who had experienced trauma, who were shy or withdrawn, but no amount of reading could have prepared her for how deeply she would need to listen, to the unspoken cues, to the stillness in the air, to the moments when nothing happened at all. And yet everything was changing. Ranger's first few moments outside the shelter were unsettling. The world beyond the walls of Cedar Ridge County Shelter was vast and overwhelming. He had never known anything like it. For the past 4 years, his life had been confined to a kennel, a small, sterile space. There was no grass beneath his paws, no trees to shelter him, no wind to ruffle his fur. It was a world of concrete and isolation. But now, as he stepped out of the car and onto the grass of his new home, he froze. Lena watched him carefully, noting the tension in his muscles, the way he stood so still, as though he were waiting for something to happen. The unfamiliar sounds of birds chirping, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and even the hum of distant traffic were overwhelming to him. Everything was too big, too open, too free. "Come on, buddy," Lena murmured, gently, stepping back toward the house, her voice soft but steady. She didn't rush him, didn't demand anything of him. She knew that this moment would be his decision, just as much as it was hers. She simply wanted him to know that he was safe, that he didn't have to worry anymore. Ranger's eyes flickered from her to the wide expanse of the yard. The grass seemed almost alien to him. In the house, with its unfamiliar scents and shadows, loomed behind her like a fortress. For a moment, it seemed as though he might retreat, turn back, run back into the car, or even curl up in the corner of the yard where the shadows provided some semblance of shelter. But then, there was a slight shift in his stance. His ears twitched, and for the first time in days, he took a cautious step forward. Lena stayed silent, watching, waiting. She didn't urge him on. She let him take his time. Kai, who had been standing quietly off to the side, watched with a kind of understanding that only he could express. He hadn't said much since they arrived, but his eyes had followed every movement Ranger made. There was a quiet energy between the two of them, as if they both understood the importance of this first step. It wasn't just a step forward in distance. It was a step forward in trust, in the willingness to believe that there was something more waiting for Ranger in this new world. As Ranger moved forward, his pace was slow, each step tentative. The grass beneath his paws was soft, unfamiliar, and he lifted his feet high, as though unsure of what to expect. His eyes darted around nervously, as though any sound, any movement, could send him spiraling back into the safety of the shelter walls. But Lena kept moving, walking slowly ahead of him, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos of his new surroundings. She was careful not to turn around too quickly, not to make any sudden movements. She simply spoke, softly but steadily. "You're okay, Ranger. You're safe. You can trust us." It wasn't an easy thing to ask of a dog who had learned, through years of abandonment and neglect, that trust was a fragile thing. Ranger had been let down before, and he had learned that the world was a place where safety was a rare luxury, and fear was a constant companion. But Lena's voice was warm, and there was something in it that told him that this time things could be different. Ranger stopped again, his head swiveling back to the car. The familiar cold steel seemed so much safer, so much more predictable. But Lena wasn't pushing him. She wasn't demanding anything. She was simply giving him the space to make his own decision. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, never moving too fast, always giving him time to catch up. And then, after what felt like an eternity of stillness, Ranger took another step. This time, it was a little more confident, a little less tentative. He moved forward, his paws making soft imprints in the grass as he edged toward the house. There was something almost sacred in the simplicity of the moment. This was not just a dog taking a step. This was a soul beginning to believe in the possibility of a different life. Lena smiled softly, the relief flooding through her. It was a small victory, but it was one that meant everything. It wasn't just a matter of getting Ranger to walk through the door or to get him accustomed to his new environment. It was about showing him that he wasn't alone anymore, that he didn't have to face the world in isolation. It was about giving him the opportunity to experience freedom, not just the physical freedom of movement, but the emotional freedom that came with knowing he could trust, that he could heal. Kai finally spoke, his voice low but sincere. "He's doing it." Lena nodded, feeling her heart swell with emotion. Yeah, he is." Together, they walked alongside Ranger, letting him take his time as he explored the yard. He was still cautious, still unsure, but he was moving. He was making progress, and that was all that mattered. The world, once so terrifying, was becoming a little less intimidating with each small step he took. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the yard, Ranger had ventured farther from the house than he ever had before. He still kept a wary eye on his surroundings, but his body was no longer as tense. His movements, though still slow, were no longer burdened by fear. He was beginning to trust in the simple joys of the world around him, the soft grass, the scent of the air, the warmth of the sun on his back. Lena and Kai stood in silence, watching as Ranger found a quiet spot in the yard, near the edge where the shadows met the light. He lay down, his body still but relaxed, his eyes half closed as he breathed in the evening air. Lena turned to Kai, her heart full. "He's come a long way today." Kai nodded, his gaze fixed on Ranger. "Yeah, but it's just the beginning, right?" Lena smiled at her son, grateful for his understanding. "Exactly, it's just the beginning." And as they stood there together, watching Ranger adjust to this new world, Lena knew that this step, no matter how small, was the first of many. It wasn't just about freeing him from the shelter. It was about giving him a chance to live, to heal, to trust again. And it was about showing him that there was more to life than pain and fear, that there was peace and home and belonging. And this, she realized, was the greatest gift she could ever give him. The days following Ranger's arrival at their home were a mixture of quiet, tentative moments and small triumphs. He wasn't yet at ease, not fully, but there was something undeniably different about him now that he had crossed the threshold of the house. He had no idea what home truly meant, but slowly, step by step, he was beginning to understand it. The house itself was quiet. A modest home in a suburban neighborhood, a place that had been empty of pets for a long time. But it had warmth, a kind of gentle comfort that Lena had always tried to fill with love and care, even in the quietest moments. It wasn't a perfect home, but it was a safe one, a safe place to heal. From the moment Ranger stepped inside, he became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. The house creaked at night, the wooden floors groaned underfoot, and there were strange sounds that came from the walls or the air vents. Every noise seemed to catch him off guard, and each time he would jump, his body tensing, his ears flicking backward. It was clear he was on edge, hyper-vigilant, as if he were constantly expecting something to go wrong. At first, he wouldn't venture far from the doorway. He'd lay down in the hallway, pressed against the wall, his body stiff, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting danger at every corner. Lena tried not to rush him. She let him stay there as long as he needed, letting him find his own comfort in his own time. Kai, too, observed quietly. He wasn't used to seeing Ranger like this. He'd read about dogs who had experienced trauma, but seeing it firsthand was different. He had always been quiet, but now, with Ranger in the house, it felt like a kind of unspoken bond was beginning to form between them. It was as if the stillness they both shared, their quiet, reflective natures, created an invisible thread that linked them. Ranger may have been the one who needed healing, but in some strange way, Kai needed it too. He had always struggled with anxiety, with finding a way to belong in a world that often felt overwhelming. And now, in this new chapter with Ranger, Kai was learning what it meant to offer something that wasn't just given out of obligation, but out of shared understanding. The first real sign of progress came when Ranger finally ventured into the living room. It was the middle of the afternoon, and Lena was sitting on the couch, reading a book. She didn't notice at first, but when she looked up, there he was, standing just inside the doorway, his eyes watching her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. He didn't move, just stood there, still as a statue, as though testing the waters. Lena smiled softly, putting down the book. "Come on, Ranger," she called gently. "It's okay. You're safe here." For a long moment he didn't respond. His tail was tucked under his body, and his eyes flickered to the open window, as if checking for threats outside. But then, slowly and with an almost imperceptible sigh, he took a step into the room. He didn't go far, just enough to be a little closer, but it was a breakthrough. Lena continued to speak to him in soft tones, her voice calm, unhurried. She didn't move too quickly, didn't make any sudden gestures. She let him come to her. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Over the next few days, the space between Ranger and the rest of the house began to shrink. He would walk from room to room, sniffing at the walls, cautiously investigating the strange objects that dotted the rooms, chairs, rugs, the coffee table that he occasionally bumped into with his nose. But still, there were moments when something would startle him, when he would flinch at the sound of the refrigerator door closing, or when a passing car would make him jump. It was clear that every new sound, every movement still held the power to set him on edge. And yet, there were small victories too. One evening, as Lena was preparing dinner, she glanced over at the kitchen where Ranger had been watching her from the doorway. For the first time, he wasn't standing frozen in place, but lying on the rug just inside the kitchen, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed as he watched her chop vegetables. The tension in his posture had eased. The floor beneath him, once foreign and uncomfortable, had become a place of rest. Lena didn't want to disturb him, so she continued with her tasks, making sure to move calmly and quietly. She knew that this was another important moment. The first time Ranger had allowed himself to just be in the house, without the constant vigilance that had once consumed him. It wasn't just the house that was different. It was the way he interacted with his new family. At first, Ranger wouldn't allow anyone too close. He wouldn't let Kai pet him, and Lena had to be patient. But gradually, Ranger began to let them approach him. One morning, Kai found himself sitting on the floor with Ranger close by, his head resting gently on Kai's knee. Kai didn't move. He stayed still, just like Ranger had, allowing the dog to adjust to the closeness at his own pace. That moment, when Ranger let Kai get close enough to rest his head on his knee, was a breakthrough. It wasn't about petting or playing. It wasn't about trying to create a bond. It was simply about presence, being with each other in quiet, unspoken understanding. The connection was slow, fragile, but it was there, forming quietly between them. At night, Ranger began to find comfort in new places. He would curl up on the rug in the living room, his body finally relaxed, his eyes soft. He no longer jumped at every sound. He began to sleep more soundly, his breath steady and deep. It wasn't perfect. He still had his moments of anxiety, still startled at certain sounds, but the progress was undeniable. Kai, too, seemed more at ease. The anxiety that had always been a part of him, quiet but ever present, seemed to ease whenever Ranger was near. There was something about the dog's silent presence that calmed him, grounded him in a way nothing else had. And so, together, they moved forward, one small victory at a time. The quiet steps toward trust, toward healing, were not always visible, not always dramatic. But they were there, every day, every moment. Lena watched them both, her heart swelling with gratitude. The house was no longer just a place where they lived. It had become a home, not just for her and Kai, but for Ranger, too. A home where healing was possible, where love was slow but steady, and where silence wasn't a sign of absence, but of understanding. As the weeks passed, the quiet moments began to accumulate. They weren't loud or dramatic moments, but they were significant, each one marking a small shift, a little crack in the armor that Ranger had built around himself. It wasn't about sudden breakthroughs or instant changes. It was about the gradual, almost imperceptible way in which Ranger was starting to feel safe, starting to trust. And with each passing day, it became clear that this was a journey not just for Ranger, but for Kai as well. Ranger's transformation wasn't immediate. It never could be. Healing from years of neglect and trauma took time, and the signs were subtle, woven into the fabric of everyday life. But these small moments, these seemingly insignificant actions, had a profound impact on both the dog and the boy, who watched him with quiet intensity. One of the most profound shifts came during those evenings when the house settled into quiet. Kai would retreat to his room, as he often did, seeking solace in his books or his music, and Ranger would follow him. At first, the dog had stayed in the living room or by the door, unsure whether he could approach the boy's space. But slowly, as the days wore on, Ranger began to follow Kai. At first, it was only a hesitant step or two, as if he were testing the waters of a new kind of connection. But eventually, Ranger would curl up at the foot of Kai's bed, lying there as the boy read or listened to music. Kai's presence, the gentle hum of his world, seemed to create a kind of peace that Ranger had never known. The dog would lie there, his eyes half closed, the rise and fall of his chest slow and steady. The quiet was something Ranger had learned to appreciate. It was safe here, in the stillness, in the absence of the chaos that had once dominated his world. And Kai, who had always struggled with his own anxiety, found a kind of comfort in Ranger's presence too. There was something deeply grounding about the dog's calm, about the way Ranger never demanded anything from him, never pushed him to be anything other than what he was. One night, as Kai sat on his bed with his headphones on, Ranger shifted. The dog's eyes tracked the boy's movements, and for a moment it seemed as though he was considering something. Then, slowly, he crawled closer to Kai. The boy didn't notice at first, too absorbed in his music. But when Ranger's head gently rested against his knee, Kai froze. It wasn't a loud or startling moment. In fact, it was so quiet that at first it almost felt like a dream. But it was real. The dog had reached out in his own way to connect. Ranger had come to Kai, unbidden, to offer comfort. Kai looked down at the dog, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite describe. He hadn't expected it, hadn't expected Ranger to trust him in this way. He slowly reached down, his fingers brushing through the dog's fur. Ranger didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply lay there, content to be close. It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. It was a quiet kind of intimacy, one that didn't need words to be understood. It was the beginning of a bond that would only deepen over time. For Lena, watching these moments unfold was bittersweet. She had always known that bringing a dog into their home would be a huge change. But seeing the way that Ranger and Kai were starting to bond was something more than she had ever hoped for. It wasn't just that they were learning to coexist, it was that they were beginning to heal together. She had hoped that adopting Ranger would help her son find some peace, some sense of connection. But what she hadn't expected was that in the process of helping Ranger find his way, she and Kai would also find something they hadn't even realized they were missing. There were other moments too, though they were less tangible. Our Ranger, once so withdrawn, now followed Kai from room to room. It wasn't always immediate, and sometimes the dog would pause, unsure whether he was welcome. But more often than not, he would eventually slip quietly into the room where Kai was, curling up at his feet as though waiting for permission to stay. Kai, who had always been reticent and never made a fuss, he didn't rush to pet Ranger, didn't force the connection. He simply let the dog be. And in turn, the dog did the same for him. Lena saw these moments for what they were, small, subtle gestures of trust. Kai was learning to accept Ranger's quiet companionship just as much as Ranger was learning to accept Kai's quiet presence. They were two souls, quiet and introverted in their own ways, finding a connection in the spaces between words. The first time Ranger sought comfort from Kai was another quiet victory. It was an afternoon, and a storm had rolled in unexpectedly. The weather in the area could change in an instant, and as the rain began to fall and the wind picked up, Lena could feel the familiar shift in the air. Ranger, too, sensed it. He froze at first, his ears perked up, his body tense. The thunder began to roll in, low and heavy, and that's when he retreated, hiding under the kitchen table, his body shaking. Lena rushed to his side, calling to him gently, trying to reassure him with her voice. But it was Kai who stepped forward. He had seen Ranger react to storms before, and he had always kept his distance, unsure how to help. But this time, something was different. Kai walked over to the trembling dog, sitting down beside him on the floor. He didn't say anything. He didn't force Ranger to move. He simply sat there, close but not demanding, as the storm raged outside. Kai's steady presence, his quiet calm, seemed to have an effect on the dog. Slowly, Ranger inched closer to him, inch by inch. I didn't reach out to pet him or try to comfort him in the usual ways. He simply stayed still, mirroring Ranger's stillness. After a while, Ranger laid down beside him, his body still trembling but no longer as rigid. Kai rested his hand gently on the dog's back, letting him know that he wasn't alone. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes. It was a moment of trust, a moment where both dog and boy learned to find comfort in the other's quiet presence. They didn't need words to communicate. They just needed to be there. And that, Lena realized, was enough. The summer days were long and hot. And with each passing week, the house felt more like home. Ranger was settling into his new life. His once hesitant steps had turned into confident movements, and the stiff, anxious energy that had defined his every action was slowly being replaced by something softer. He was beginning to trust, not just in the safety of the house, but in the people who shared it with him. His eyes, once dull and distant, now seemed to hold a light of curiosity, of cautious optimism. But, as with all things, trust was fragile. It was a delicate thing, and it had to be tested, sometimes in ways that neither Lena nor Kai expected. The storm had come out of nowhere, rolling in like a distant rumble, before suddenly crashing overhead with the ferocity of a thunderclap. Kai and Lena had been in the living room when the first boom of thunder startled them both. Ranger, who had been lying at Kai's feet, jumped up instantly, his body tense, his fur bristling. The calm that had surrounded him in recent weeks seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by panic. Lena had seen Ranger react to storms before. His instinct was to run and hide, to find shelter wherever he could, but this time he seemed different. He didn't run for the familiar corner by the door or retreat to the shadows of the hallway. This time he froze, his body rigid with fear, eyes wide and panicked as each new crack of thunder sent him into a state of heightened alert. It was clear that he was terrified. His breathing quickened, and he began pacing frantically in circles. His ears were flattened against his head, and every rumble of thunder made him jump, his paws slipping on the polished floor. "Ranger, it's okay," Lena called, her voice calm but urgent. But the words seemed to have no effect. The dog's fear was too overwhelming for comfort, for reassurance. He couldn't hear her through the storm. His mind was too lost in the chaos. Kai, watching from the couch, felt a sharp pang of empathy for the dog. He knew the terror of feeling trapped, the way anxiety could take over until there was nothing left but the fear itself. He knew what it felt like to have your body shake uncontrollably, to feel like the world was too loud, too big, and too frightening to understand. And though he had always been reluctant to show affection, reluctant to reach out, something shifted in him. Without a word, Kai stood up from the couch. He walked slowly toward Ranger, his movements deliberate, each step measured and calm. The dog's eyes followed him, wide and frantic, but Ranger didn't retreat. Instead, he seemed to pause, his body still trembling, but no longer running in circles. Kai stopped in front of him. He didn't speak. It didn't try to comfort him with words. He just knelt down, staying at the dog's level, watching him with a quiet patience that seemed to pull Ranger's focus away from the storm. Slowly, Kai extended his hand toward the dog, his palm open and steady. Ranger flinched at first, his body instinctively pulling back, as if every part of him was telling him to run. But Kai didn't move. He didn't try to grab the dog or force him into a position of comfort. He simply remained there, his hand extended, unmoving, offering an invitation without expectation. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, there was an island of calm. For what felt like an eternity, Ranger didn't move. He just stood there, frozen in the moment, torn between his instincts to flee and his growing recognition that something about this situation, this quiet presence of the boy, was different. And then, slowly, Ranger took a step forward. It was small, tentative, like a whisper of trust that had been buried deep inside him, a trust that had been nurtured by months of quiet patience. The dog's nose brushed against Kai's hand, and in that moment, the storm outside felt miles away. Kai gently closed his fingers around Ranger's head, not pulling him in, but simply resting his touch there. The dog flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. The shaking began to lessen, the frantic energy beginning to dissolve into something more manageable, more familiar. Ranger sat down slowly, his body trembling less now, his breathing evening out. He didn't relax entirely. There was still some lingering tension in his muscles, but he stayed there, leaning against Kai, as the thunder continued to boom above them. Kai remained still, his hand resting gently on Ranger's head, offering no judgment, no pressure, just presence. Lena watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with both pride and gratitude. It was a quiet victory, a moment that was more about the slow, tender build of trust than any sudden breakthrough. She had known that it would take time for Ranger to adjust to the world, and she had known that storms, with their loud, unpredictable nature, would be one of the hardest things for him to endure. But seeing Kai, her reserved son, step into that moment and offer something as simple and profound as his calm presence, made her heart swell. She realized that, in his own way, Kai was healing too. He was learning how to be a source of comfort, how to offer calm in the midst of chaos, just as Ranger had done for him in so many quiet moments. As the storm finally began to subside, the rumbling of thunder slowly fading into the distance, Ranger remained by Kai's side. His body was still, his breathing steady, and though he didn't look fully relaxed, he no longer seemed afraid. The trust between them, it had been tested, and in that testing, it had deepened. "Good boy," Kai whispered softly, his voice barely audible as he continued to stroke the dog's fur. He didn't need to say anything more. The bond between them had been forged in the silence, in the quiet moments of presence. Ranger remained close to Kai for the rest of the evening. The storm had passed, but the calm that had followed was something deeper. It was a quiet understanding, an unspoken connection that grew stronger with every shared moment. The trust between them wasn't something that could be rushed, something that could be forced. It was something that, in its own time, was quietly earned. Lena watched the two of them from across the room, her heart full. It wasn't just Ranger who had learned to trust. It was Kai, too, in his own way. Together, they were learning to navigate the storms, to find peace in the quiet moments. And in the process, they were teaching each other what it meant to heal, to trust, and to be seen. The months passed, and with them, the house settled into a rhythm. Ranger, once the silent, withdrawn figure, had become a steady presence. He still had his moments, times when a sudden sound would make him flinch, or when an unfamiliar sight would cause him to hesitate. But those moments were becoming fewer. With each passing day, he grew a little braver, a little more at ease with the world around him. Lena noticed the change in him most when they went out. In the past, Ranger had been overwhelmed by even the simplest trips to the park or the store. He would freeze in the car, his body rigid, his eyes wide with anxiety. But now, And when Lena took him for walks or let him play in the yard, there was a calmness to his movements that hadn't been there before. He still stuck close to her, but there was no longer the fearful urgency to his steps. He was beginning to enjoy the outside world, to feel the grass beneath his paws and the cool air on his face. One Saturday morning, Lena decided to take Ranger to a local dog adoption fair. It wasn't something she had planned on doing, but it felt like the right time. It would be a good way to socialize him, to see how he interacted with other dogs and people, to test his comfort level in a public space. She had always wanted to volunteer at these kinds of events, but the thought of bringing Ranger into such a chaotic environment had seemed overwhelming at first. Now, she felt a sense of readiness, both for him and for herself. Kai, who had always been hesitant about large crowds, had been quiet when Lena suggested the idea. But he didn't object. He had been watching Ranger with quiet interest, observing the changes in him, and he was beginning to see the dog in a new light. Not just as a companion, but as someone who had helped him learn to trust, someone who had shown him how to find peace in quiet moments. They arrived at the event, a bustling gathering of families and volunteers, all gathered to meet and hopefully adopt dogs from the local shelter. The energy was high, with barking dogs and children running about, but it wasn't chaotic in a way that felt threatening. It was a place of possibilities, of new beginnings, and for the first time in a long while, Lena felt that it was the right place for Ranger. They walked slowly through the event, Ranger on a leash, with Lena guiding him gently, her hand resting on his back. He was cautious, but he wasn't frozen with fear like he had been at the shelter or when they first arrived home. He walked beside her, his ears alert, but his movements controlled. He was learning how to navigate this new world. As they passed the various booths, Lena noticed that people were drawn to Ranger. He wasn't the loud, excitable dog that some people expected at adoption events, but there was something quietly compelling about him. Something in the way he carried himself. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't jumping up to get attention. Instead, he walked with dignity, with a calmness that seemed to calm others around him. At one booth, a small, trembling puppy was sitting in a crate, her eyes wide with fear. The puppy was shaking, unable to move, overwhelmed by the noise and the strangers walking past. She was so different from Ranger, young, fragile, and full of anxiety. But as they passed by, something unexpected happened. Ranger stopped in his tracks. At first, Lena thought it was just another moment of hesitation, another flicker of anxiety. But then she realized that Ranger wasn't just standing still. He was looking at the puppy, his eyes soft, his body slightly lowered, as if he were assessing her. And the puppy, sensing his presence, stopped shaking for a moment. Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief second, there was a kind of quiet recognition between them, a shared understanding of fear, of what it felt like to be lost and alone. Ranger, who had once been the scared, withdrawn dog, suddenly did something Lena never expected. He lay down beside the crate, his body still, his head gently resting on the edge. He didn't bark or jump up. He simply stayed there, as if offering the puppy his quiet support, his presence a silent promise that she wasn't alone. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she watched the scene unfold. It was a gesture that was so simple, yet so profound. Ranger, the dog who had once been invisible to the world, now offering comfort to another soul in need. Kai, standing beside her, noticed too. He was quiet, but there was a softness in his eyes as he watched the interaction. This wasn't just about Ranger finding peace. It was about Ranger becoming something greater than himself. In this moment, he wasn't just the dog who had been rescued. He was the one offering healing. The volunteers at the booth watched in awe. One of them stepped forward, her voice gentle but surprised. "That's incredible," she said, her eyes wide. "He's helping her?" Lena nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "He's always been that way. Quiet, but full of heart." As the moments passed, the puppy's shaking began to lessen. She seemed to relax, her body slowly unwinding as she felt Ranger's presence. It was a quiet miracle, a simple act of kindness that spoke volumes about the healing power of connection. Lena and Kai stayed for a little while longer, allowing Ranger to sit by the crate. There was something profound about that moment, something that filled the space between them with thorough understanding. Ranger had once been the dog no one wanted, the dog no one believed could be healed. But here he was, offering comfort to another, showing the world that healing wasn't just about finding peace for yourself. It was about sharing that peace with others. As they left the fair later that afternoon, Lena felt a deep sense of pride in Ranger. He had come so far, and yet he wasn't finished. He had found out a way into their hearts, into their home. But now, he was something more. He was a quiet hero, offering the love and trust he had once been denied to someone else. Kai turned to his mother as they walked to the car, his voice soft but certain. He's not just a dog, is he? Lena smiled, her heart full. No, he's not just a dog. He's our hero. Ranger's quiet act of kindness at the adoption fair didn't go unnoticed. Was the volunteers, the onlookers, and even the families there with their own dogs were deeply moved by what they had witnessed. The image of Ranger lying calmly beside the frightened puppy, offering his quiet comfort, was something that stayed with them long after the event ended. It wasn't just a dog showing empathy. It was a moment that spoke to the very essence of second chances, healing, and what it truly meant to care for someone else. It wasn't long before the local media caught wind of the story. A photographer from a local newspaper had been at the event, and the moment he captured the serene, almost sacred image of Ranger with the puppy began to make its rounds on social media. The picture spread quickly, and the story behind it started to take on a life of its own. Ranger, once the dog who had been labeled unadoptable, had become a symbol of resilience, of transformation, and of the power of love to heal even the most broken hearts. Lena wasn't prepared for the flood of attention. At first, it was just a few comments on social media, some likes, and then a local news story that ran for a few minutes on the evening broadcast. But then, something remarkable happened. The story took off. People were moved by the image of the once forgotten dog reaching out to comfort another, and that story resonated with them. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how broken, was beyond hope. It was a reminder that second chances weren't just for people, but for animals, too. One morning, Lena woke up to find her inbox flooded with messages. Some were from people sharing their own stories of adopted pets. Others were from people wanting to donate to the shelter where Ranger had been rescued. A few messages were from families interested in adopting other dogs from the shelter. Inspired by Ranger's story. It wasn't just about one dog anymore. It was about the ripple effect of hope that Ranger had created. And then there was the phone call from the shelter. Lena, Sarah, the shelter manager said, her voice full of emotion. You won't believe this, but the story about Ranger has gone viral. People are asking about him, about his journey, about how he went from being a dog no one wanted to the dog who helped a puppy find peace. It's incredible. It's inspiring. Lena smiled as she listened. She could hardly believe it. Ranger's quiet, humble transformation was turning into something bigger than she had ever imagined. The shelter, once a place where Ranger had languished unnoticed, was now becoming a place of hope. The story of his change was touching people in ways Lena hadn't expected. It was giving them the courage to consider adopting dogs who had been overlooked, dogs who had been waiting for their second chance. The following week, the local newspaper ran a full feature on Ranger. The article, accompanied by the image of him with the puppy, told the story of his life, his time in the shelter, his quiet withdrawal, and the powerful moment when he had become a hero for another dog. The article didn't just focus on Ranger's story, it also highlighted the importance of adopting animals in need, of seeing the value in those who might seem too broken to love. Lena's phone rang constantly that week, not just with messages of support, but also with questions. People wanted to know more about the dog who had made such an impact. They wanted to know how they could help. A few even asked if they could meet him, but Lena, always protective of Ranger's quiet life, decided against it. Ranger had come so far, and she didn't want him to be overwhelmed. Instead, she focused on using the attention to help other dogs like him. Inspired by the overwhelming response, Lena began volunteering more at the shelter. She didn't just donate time, she helped organize events, worked on outreach programs, and even began fostering other dogs who needed a quiet, loving environment. Ranger became her inspiration, and together they helped spread the message that every dog, no matter how broken, deserved a second chance. Ranger, in his quiet way, had become a symbol of resilience. He had shown that even the most scarred souls could heal if given the right space, time, and love. And in doing so, he had inspired a whole community of people to open their hearts and their homes to animals who needed them. But for Ranger, none of this mattered. He didn't understand the impact he had made on the world. He didn't understand that he was being celebrated. He simply continued to be the calm, steady presence that he had always been. He still followed Kai from room to room, still curled up at the foot of his bed each night, still quietly offered his presence to others in need, whether it was a scared puppy at a fair or a child needing comfort. For Ranger, the real reward had never been the attention or the accolades. It was the quiet companionship that he had found with Kai and Lena, the peace that came from knowing he was finally home. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the soft golden light filled the backyard, Lena sat on the porch with Kai, watching Ranger as he lay in the grass, his body stretched out in the warmth. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and steady. "He really has come a long way," Lena said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Kai nodded, his eyes following Ranger's relaxed form. "He has. But I think he's always been a hero. He just needed someone to see it." Lena smiled, her heart full. "I think you're right." The world had finally seen Ranger for who he truly was. Not just a dog who had been abandoned, but a dog who had found his way back to the light. And in doing so, he had shown others that healing was always possible. That everyone, no matter how lost they seemed, deserved to be seen. The backyard had become a sanctuary for Ranger. It was the place where the sun bathed him in warmth, where the cool evening breeze ruffled his fur, and where he could finally let his guard down, not needing to worry about the next loud sound or the next unexpected twist in his life. For the first time in his 5 years, Ranger could just be. He had a space where he was safe, loved, and, most importantly, seen for who he truly was. Lena and Kai stood in the open doorway of the house, watching Ranger in the fading sunlight. His body was stretched out on the grass, his legs splayed in that lazy, content way that only dogs could manage, his eyes half closed in peaceful slumber. The weight of the world that had once pressed on his shoulders seemed to have lifted. The fear, the anxiety, the resignation, all of it had dissipated in the presence of the people who loved him. As they watched Ranger, Lena thought back to the day they had brought him home. He had been so uncertain, so fragile, standing at the threshold of the house, unsure of what the future would bring. Back then, it had been hard to imagine this moment, the one where Ranger could sleep soundly in the sun, where he could lie down and feel no more fear of the unknown. But this wasn't just Ranger's victory. It was Kai's, too. Kai had come a long way since that first hesitant meeting with Ranger. He had learned more than just how to take care of a dog. He had learned to offer himself the same kindness that Ranger had needed. In caring for Ranger, Kai had found a new kind of strength within himself. The dog's quiet presence had helped him open up in ways he never had before. And as the bond between them deepened, so did Kai's understanding of himself. His anxiety, once a constant companion, was now something he could manage. Something he had learned to cope with. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't as overpowering. He had a friend now, a companion who knew how to sit in the silence without demanding anything, who understood what it meant to simply be there. In a way, it felt like the three of them had chosen each other. Ranger had chosen Lena when he had her leaned into her hand in the shelter, when he had offered that first flicker of trust. Kai had chosen Ranger too, without fully realizing it, when he had sat quietly beside him during the storm, offering the stillness that Ranger so desperately needed. And Lena, well, she had chosen them both. She had opened her heart to a dog who had been overlooked and ignored, and in doing so, had given herself the opportunity to love in a way she had never had before. And now, as they stood together, watching Ranger bask in the sun, Lena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just that she had given Ranger a home, it was that he had given them so much in return. He had shown them the power of patience, of quiet presence, of unconditional love. He had taught them how to heal, how to forgive, and how to trust again. For a brief moment, Lena closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the backyard wash over her. The rustling leaves, the distant chirp of birds, the occasional bark of a dog down the street. It was a peaceful world, one she had come to appreciate more deeply in recent months. The world was big, and it could be frightening at times, but in this small, quiet corner of it, there was peace. There was home. "He's perfect," Kai said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an emotion in it that Lena couldn't quite name. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something softer. He had come to understand Ranger in a way that few people could. Kai had once been the quiet, introverted boy who had struggled to find his place, but now, with Ranger by his side, he had become someone different, someone stronger, more confident, someone who had learned that love could be quiet. But it was no less powerful for it. Lena smiled and nodded, her eyes still on the dog. "He is perfect, isn't he?" Kai's gaze shifted to her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. The connection between them, between all three of them, was palpable. It was a connection built on trust, on shared moments of vulnerability, and on the knowledge that they had found something precious in one another. "I think he chose us too," Kai said, his voice quiet but sure. "Not just you choosing him, but him choosing us." Lena chuckled softly, feeling her heart swell. She had never thought of it that way, but Kai was right. They hadn't just rescued Ranger from the shelter. They had all chosen each other. In the simplest of ways, they had found what they needed in one another, and in doing so, they had created a family, one that had been built on empathy, patience, and quiet moments of understanding. Yeah, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the yard, Lena walked over to where Ranger lay, stretching out beside him. He lifted his head slightly at the sound of her footsteps, but when he saw who it was, he simply relaxed, letting out a contented sigh as he nestled back into the soft grass. Kai followed, sitting beside his mother, watching the dog for a moment. And then, with a small smile, he looked over at her. "You know," he began, his voice thoughtful, I think Ranger's helped me more than I could ever help him." Lena nodded, her heart full. "I think you're right, Kai. You've both helped each other." And in that moment, surrounded by the soft light of the evening, Lena knew that this was what home was. It wasn't about the walls or the furniture or the space. It was about the people and the animals who made a place feel safe, who filled it with love, and who healed each other in the process. Ranger had found his home, and in doing so had reminded them all that home was where healing could happen. It was a place where love was quiet but deep, where second chances were given, and where no one was ever truly alone. In the end, Lena understood that every soul deserves to be seen, not for how loud they are, but for how quietly they endure. And that was the greatest gift of all, the ability to be seen, to be heard, and to be loved. Kai Ranger, and Lena. Together, they had found a new beginning.